Hello, I'm Gus Downing, publisher and editor of the D&D Daily, and this is the LP News Network. Today's episode is about organized retail crime and the great debate over how big the problem really is. We've all heard the number of $30 billion, and we all have our opinions. And in today's session, we'll hear from 3 LP leaders and get their thoughts. We'll also talk about the fact that for the first time in history, the National Retail Security Survey this past year showed that ORC is actually a bigger problem than internal theft, a finding that has long-range implications and could bring more resources, more state laws, and maybe even a federal law long-term. Also, how are the decriminalization trends that are happening around the country and on a federal level going to impact ORC? And finally, what about a national database? With us today to discuss these topics is John Mattis, Vice President, Asset Protection Investigations and ORC at Macy's, Millie Kresevich, Director, Asset Protection at Luxottica, and Scott Sanford, Director of Investigations and Training at Barnes & Noble, Inc. John, Millie, Scott, thanks for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The first question is, let's start off with a great debate. How big is the ORC problem, and what's the number? John Mattis?
So, great question, and I'll answer it right off the bat and tell you that we feel strongly that it's understated. So, and I say that based on the fact that when you look at it over the last couple of years, it's been at that $30 billion mark. So let me back that up. So when you look at all of the different types of things that are going on from an organized retail crime perspective, really have to incorporate all of the different facets of what is actually happening out there. So yes, you're going to have the regular door hits, the grab and run, that type of activity, where the individuals are going to sell the merchandise, whether online or in bodegas, things like that. But there's so much more out there as far as the types of crimes that are impacting retailers that are organized. So, and what we're seeing over the last couple of years is a very systematic attack on our processes as retailers. So as we develop procedures and programs and things to help make the shopping experience great for our customers, the ease of a shopping experience, whether it's omni-channel, mobile technology, the organized retail crime phenomena has automatically, in lockstep, been able to jump on that as well. So when you look at all of the different types of frauds that are out there, whether it's return fraud, whether it's cyber fraud or cyber breaches and attacking of our network infrastructures, all of that are attacks against retailers that really has to be included in that overall organized retail crime number. So that's really the thought process there. But when you really look at it, you look at it year after year. When you look at fraud activity over the last 10 years has risen like 15% every year. So when you look at that and you apply it to some of the other variables, it looks like 15% in a lot of different things, but not ORC. So, if you apply that overall 15% across the board every single year, you could sort of get a number as to where we probably are from an overall ORC perspective.
So you're actually including cyber crime to a certain extent?
Absolutely.
When it's against the nation's retailers?
Absolutely.
Okay. Any desire to pick a number out there? Or?
I would say when you look at the overall number and you compound it year after year, it's over $60 billion. It has to be.
Scott?
My thoughts, which is why they call it a debate, differ from John, but well noted, and he did take a lot of my thunder. I will say this, that if we're going to look at a true number, you have to consider everything that falls into it. That 3.19 trillion, which is the sales number for all of retail, that has backed out a lot of other retail industry that we don't typically talk about in the NRSS. So all that being said, I think it's where we started with 30 billion several years ago. I believe that number was in fact inflated way back when. It's my thoughts. And a lot of people that know me would think, wow, really, Scott's saying that number's inflated? I do believe 30 billion is inflated. If our inventory shrink is at 44 billion, going with the numbers that Doc Hollinger reported, if it is in fact 44 billion, I believe probably 50% of that ticket is related to external theft. And I am of the opinion that 80% of the problem is driven by 20% of the individuals. So
the 80-20 rule.
The 80-20 rule. But probably more closely, 90-10 rule. I would think that the bulk of our shoplifting problem, ORC related, is driven by 10% of the shoplifters out there. You know, I would probably put that ticket probably a little closer to 20 billion maybe. But the reality is, it's only as good as the information is given. And in our industry, I'm not sure if everyone gives a tremendous amount of review to the merchandising hierarchy and what's really driving your inventory shrinkage. That's something we do very closely at Barnes & Noble, and not just at corporate level, we do it at store level. Our store managers are encouraged to classify their inventory shrink at year end. You know, who better to make that determination, what's driving their shrink, than the person that's at the store and they recall incidents that occurred during the 12-month inventory period, right? So I think that there's a lot of uncertainty in the number. And it's a moving target. It's constantly changing. But I don't think 30 billion is the right number.
So 80% of 22 or 90% of 22 billion?
I would probably say 80% of 22 billion.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say that. But John's got a valid point. There's a lot of things we're not looking at. Gift card fraud, you know, reshipping schemes, triangulation things of that nature. But let's put it in perspective, you know. Online sales represent, what, about $350 billion of total retail sales? It's still a relatively small, albeit growing portion of total retail. But nonetheless, there's a lot of crime out there, and we have to consider that as well. I think it's time for the industry to regroup and consider what's really falls under the ORC umbrella.
To redefine it.
Yes.
And to become more inclusive of the credit cards, as a result of the data breaches, cybercrime, and all of that impact on the number.
Any organized attack on a retailer.
Yeah.
And really the 30 billion was as a result of just shoplifting, the theft from a store. That was the definition, or at least the opinion, I think, of most people. Yeah. And it really didn't encompass the cyber side and a lot of the phony credit cards, the fake credit cards and such, which are driven by the Romanians and the data breaches and so on.
Which is clearly organized.
Right, absolutely, I'd say so. Millie, your opinion?
I think it's difficult to measure. As we just talked, it doesn't necessarily encompass all of the avenues for deviance and the cyber issues that we're having. So I think it's difficult to measure, and we're relying on several variables, right? We're relying on employees to report things accurately, right? And then can we prove that the merchandise moved to money at some point, right? So we have to prove, is there offense? There's certain variables that have to be proved. And then further, with the laws, even if there are laws like the 30 states that have ORC laws, are people really being prosecuted under those laws, or is it being pled down to other levels of theft, and now it's not really ORC? So I think it's very difficult to place a measurable number on that type of crime.
Good point, and it's going to be very difficult to measure it in the future.
Yes.
Until we all have a definition. But I would imagine, though, that a lot of the reporters who have been educated over the last few years by virtue of the laws being on the books, because before these laws existed, the reporters didn't know. I mean, they didn't know about ORC. But now we've seen in the media where more reporters are reporting on it because that's what they see in the books at the police stations, and they're reporting that data. John Doe charged with ORC. They're not necessarily saying, okay, he was found guilty or she was found guilty, or it was reduced to. What they're mostly reporting is who was busted last night, and here's the case behind it. So there's a lot of variables there, and I agree with you. It's virtually impossible to measure it, especially when we have all these other variables involved, until we all can sit down and say, okay, what is it, and what are we going to include it? I mean, we do kind of agree, though, that it's 90% of 22 billion, as high as 60 billion. So, and that's a huge number. So, and hopefully with this survey from Hollinger, the NRSS, we'll hopefully see its impact on the retail senior level to bring more resources to bear in the fight against it. So, the next question. Now let's talk about the NRSS finding that ORC is actually bigger than internal theft. Because all of us have spent our careers being told, hey, internal theft is the #1 reason we, our #1 shrink problem. And now we're having the studies say, no, it isn't, is ORC. Okay, so Scott, you want to start there?
Sure. Well, first off, I agree fully with the survey that external theft is larger than internal theft. And, a couple things I want to call out here. The recession hit retailers very hard, and I think we've all learned over the last nearly a decade now that we can do more with less. And I believe from an internal standpoint, our employee base got that much better, at least on behalf of Barnes & Noble. You know, when you're dealing with X amount of employees and you're shrinking that, whether it be through attrition or forced ranking, you're going to keep the cream of the crop, right? So I think that with the advancements in technology and point-of-sale exception reporting, we've been able to curb internal theft more. But along the same lines of technology and the advent of online marketplace, we've seen more and more people that were your traditional random or even habitual, if I want to use that term, shoplifter, that wasn't necessarily doing it to make a living. They have the ability now to make a very handsome salary stealing and selling with a bit of anonymity. And they've got that worldwide customer base. So I believe that external theft, my personal opinion is that it's, for several years it's been larger than internal theft and more of a threat to retailers. But it's nice that it's finally getting recognized as you know, for what it really is.
But isn't part of internal theft part of ORC? I mean, if we have 2 employees working with 6 people on the outside, I mean, isn't that ORC?
Yep.
So isn't a certain percentage of internal part of the ORC problem as well? So doesn't that ball kind of move depending on the case and what you're looking at?
Sure.
Okay, so
if it ties into it, sure.
Yeah. John, your opinion on that?
So, you know, when you look at it over the last couple of years, you know, we really feel strongly that the overall ORC phenomenon is bigger than internal theft. And, you know, you see it in a lot of the different equations as to, and the types of things that we're seeing as retailers. And it also, you know, it's a lot based on the different types of retailers you have just at this table. So whether it's a, you know, a big box or a specialty retailer, you know, the amount of employees that you have in a particular location obviously has an impact in the types of thefts that you'll have there. Now, when you look at internal theft, and really where it gets very dangerous is when you have the ORC internal working with an external group. That is, you know, that's the nirvana for an ORC operator, to be able to have, you know, the inside track on what's happening in a particular store. So, and that's really where it gets scary. So, but bottom line, ORC is generally a bigger overall issue than internal. But, you know, and internal is still a big thing.
Millie?
I think retailers have placed a considerable amount of effort in detecting and preventing internal crime, and that in turn has allowed external crime to kind of creep up. The overarching tentacles that are associated with organized retail crime, inadequate laws to address retail crime, and an inability to properly measure it has allowed the external components of that type of crime to now rise above internal. And again, like you state, there's compounding issues when you have employees involved in the situation, but does that case really go in as an ORC case, or does it just stay internal? So I think it reaches different boundaries on both avenues.
Okay, the last question, what about the decriminalization trends? How is that trend going to impact ORC long term? The prisons are filled, the feds are releasing 40,000 nonviolent, mostly drug offenders, most of which were also involved in theft, okay, according to one of the releases I read. How is that going to impact ORC? Millie?
Yes. So here's the situation. So with Proposition 47, right, in California, the decriminalization efforts, we need to be able to understand the unintended consequences of such a measure. In the state of California, the goal of Proposition 47 was to reduce the prison population, rehabilitate drug offenders, and reduce the amount of prison time associated with theft, related crimes, and drug possession crimes. The particular proposition did indeed reduce the prison population, but its unintended consequences has, what it is essentially it's driven up the crime rates in that state. So in the state of California, specifically in Los Angeles County, property crimes are up 8%. Overall, in at least 10 counties, violent crimes and property theft crimes are up in those particular areas. So when we construct laws to address one thing, we need to be sure that we're reviewing and understanding the implications of such a decision. And the rehabilitation aspect of the drug offenses, it's not doing its job either, because we are not seeing the rehabilitation efforts. So now all of those individuals who were let out are now reoffending, and no proper rehabilitation program to address their needs.
Scott?
Oh, I agree fully with what Millie's saying, and just looking at it from a common sense perspective, the bad guy, when they're put back on the street, they need a job, and people aren't bending over backwards to hire someone with a criminal record and a felony.
Even with a ban in the box? Sorry.
But the whole point is, if you look at traditional recidivism rates when it pertains to drug and theft offenders, it's very high. And without that added deterrent of potentially going back and doing time for my crime, these nonviolent shoplifting crimes, it stands to reason that we should see an influx of shoplifting, and we've actually seen that in California ourselves as well. So, I think that we need to take that in consideration. And I would say, from an approach perspective, we have to move on regardless of what the judicial system is doing.
Right.
And there are alternative approaches. And I will tell you that we've done a nice job prosecuting people, but we have to work very hard to get that to happen. If someone's got money, if someone's got the means to reconcile with you, we have to look at that as well. We worked with Frank Luciano and his team several years ago as a direct result of the challenges of prosecuting some of these prolific ORC groups. And I got to tell you, we've been very pleased if we cannot get a successful prosecution, work in more of a civil type compromise. If someone's got that money squirreled away and you're looking at $100,000 lump sum, you really have to look long and hard at doing that. And I think what Paul Jones and the Turning Point Justice folk groups are doing right now to address the first time offender up front, that adds value as well. Ideally, we'd see some reversals down the road, but in the interim, I think we have to move forward wisely.
Well, even the federal government, when they were going through their program of releasing the 40,000 plus criminals, one of their studies, their own studies, actually said a 47% recidivism rate.
Yes.
47%. That's what they released the day they released the program results. So they knew, up front what the problem was going to be when they opened the doors. So they knew that and are planning for it, quite frankly. And I found that to be just astonishing. But John, your opinion on it?
So the bottom line is that there's 40,000 plus additional criminal element that's on the streets, it's in the malls, it's in our stores. And what has happened is that you'll see those general nuisance type crimes that always occur in the malls and stores and things like that, increased shoplifting activity. And in some of that increased shoplifting activity, some aggressive and violent response back from an apprehension, putting our detectives in danger based on dealing with a certain element that was not there in the past or would have been incarcerated in the past. And then when you add in there the recidivist rate, and the individuals that were never apprehended before, but we're always operating with these individuals, and some of those had been incarcerated, the number grows even bigger. But bottom line is that it's created an environment where we have increased apprehensions, increased violent type apprehensions, as well as the different types of things that go along with it. The overall quality of life, the issues that are occurring in malls, the customers that don't want to come to malls or certain areas because of crime that's occurring, that the government has created, so to speak, but we need to be able to find a way to be able to deal with it and deal with the overall shoplifter that's been apprehended multiple times, and how do we deal with those individuals? Because it's because, Prop 47 it's made it so that shoplifting is not a big deal.
Right.
And that is sending the wrong message.
Yeah, but we don't have the space, the time, or the money. Bottom line.
Yep.
So what we have is an old ORC definition that needs to be redefined.
Yep.
We have a problem that's either 90% of 22 billion or up as high as 60 billion. We have cybercrime that now should be included. And we have a decriminalization trend that's going to have at least a 47% recidivism rate with the prisoners that we're releasing. That's a heck of a problem. Do we all agree with those numbers and assumptions? With what I just said?
Yeah, it
Absolutely.
definitely needs to look. We need to look very closely as an industry and redefine what ORC is. Inclusion of e-commerce, and you know,
Keep fighting it.
keep fighting
There
the fight.
you go.
We need to come up with it.
Well,
'Cause the
that's
bottom
it
line-
for this episode, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for watching. And until next time, let's keep them safe out there.